Hey guys, it's Matthew here once again, and by this point our Ice Spear journey has come to its inevitable conclusion, in which I've killed everything I possibly can with this, what is basically shit tier skill compared to a lot of other skills out there. So the challenge was to play Ice Spear all the way through without resorting to anything better like Frostbolt, Freezing Pulse, or any of that. We did kill Shaper, did kill Uber Siri, and I will show you those clips a little bit later. I just wanted to go over a bit what the build looks like, how it's playing so far, and yeah, what we did to build it. So this is some of the gameplay with some breach action in tier 14, 15 maps, that sort of thing, and it clears pretty damn well. Like I mentioned in the previous video, basically what we're missing here is a threshold jewel to make it somewhat viable for actual gameplay. It is still okay in its current form that you can see here, but the problem is I did have to get quite a lot of damage scaling and good gear to make it anywhere near worth a damn at this level. And the biggest perk of the skill, as you can see here, is freezing some bosses. Now that runs out of utility and use quite definitely in the end game, except for a few choice boss fights, but for the most part you're not freezing or chilling anything terribly reliably when we get to the tier 16s and all of that. Whereas the normal bosses, tier 12 to 15, you can still freeze most of those, and the defensive part of Ice Spear and its main draw, the freeze and chill, actually works pretty well. But for the most part, once you get down to the end game, it ends up being shit. You can see here, even with GMP, I'm still managing to freeze a tier 12 tool from the breach. Not too bad at all, and the big problem there is that we do have to use GMP most of the time, which cuts our damage a lot as opposed to hypothermia in its place for single target. Now with this clip here, I just wanted to show you what some of the gameplay look like involving Lightning Warp, because with this sort of build you can't really justify a, leap slam, or you're not using a shield charge thanks to wearing a staff, which I felt like I needed to do for maximum damage. So you do have to Lightning Warp around a lot, and you can see it's not terrible, it is still fast enough. I was still maintaining something like 200 mil in an hour while mapping. It is fairly uncomfortable compared to a shield charge or whirling blade playstyle though. It just was not anywhere near as enjoyable as shield charging, as well as that you don't get any fortify action. And then in some boss fights, lightning warping around really gets you in trouble, and I'll go into more detail on that when we get to the tier 16s. But for now, here is Uber Otsiri. The trash was actually quite a dream. Absolutely no real threat to me whatsoever clearing trash. Everything's getting frozen. I have very good range capabilities, and the damage was actually quite good as well. And Uber Otsiri was what I figured while I was playing the build would be my easiest bet at the end game content, because well, a lot of the Otsiri stuff can be frozen and chilled, and these fights over here aren't terribly challenging for the way my character is set up, and being at range for the most part is not a very hard task, as opposed to the Guardians themselves, which are quite hard to get away from. So over here, the ranged trio chick died pretty damn quickly, and then the second one, I wanted to kill the dual striker. I kind of fucked up and ended up killing the Cycloner first, which meant I had to face the dual striker alone, and when he went Super Saiyan, it totally wrecked me. And also, that's what happens when you have mind over matter and run into a degen. You run out of mana and then you can't lightning warp. So I did die a couple times there to my own foolish mistakes, but overall it wasn't too bad. And then Otsiri over here was actually a very controlled fight. I died once due to being an idiot again, but if you set it up just right, this split phase over here, you can freeze the split phase and then it becomes very safe indeed. Right there I kind of messed up as well and got hit by a few things, but actually you can run around and play this very safe, and Ice Spear ends up being pretty damn nice for all of this. You chill her quite reliably, you have decent damage, and you can keep her out range. And then right here, as I mentioned, when you get a perfect lineup on the two adds you want to actually attack, boom, frozen, very safe, and the damage is pretty good. So overall, Uber Otsiri was a comfortable end game fight for us. But then come the Guardians, and the drawbacks and real necessity of a threshold of the skill are absolutely exposed. So the Guardians do, for the most part, try and get in your face and attack you. All except for, I suppose, Hydra, who just stands back and attacks you with a fairly consistent barrage of 3 different attacks. Chimera, for example, is always trying to get in your grill, and he's got several gap closing mechanics and all that, and this Chimera over here did have 50% monster life from the map roll, so it wasn't that quick a kill, meaning I did have to actually play the game around him for a fair bit, and that's really hard to do, especially with a single proj where you can't reliably hit off screen too well, because you very much have to be targeting the guy and see what you're doing. The ads were fine. Chimera himself, yeah, it's really hard to get the damage in, even though we have pretty decent damage on Ice Spear, just mechanically it was kind of a clusterfuck. Likewise for Hydra, the whole mechanic of having your secondary sort of, I guess, damage projectile thing happen when you're attacking halfway is kind of a pretty outdated mechanic at this point, because a lot of these bosses are just fucked. So having to sit back and try and hit Hydra while dodging all of the balls and dodging all 3 of the different attacks is damn near impossible without being a berserker here, and this isn't a very hard-rolled Hydra. It's got 2 additional proj and minus max. So that's about it. If she's got any sort of speed or better damage, it's going to be completely ridiculous. Did still manage to kill it deathless, but it took a fairly long time, like 3 or 4 minutes, and it was very risky overall. Phoenix, once again, you really could use a threshold jewel here. Not having my GMP in is a pretty huge drawback for clearing, well, Phoenix himself and then his ads. And when you put the GMP in, the damage is pretty lackluster. So I start out with some fairly comfortable single target. This map, by the way, has minus max on it and 2 additional proj, so it is a little bit harder with the phoenixes and all that. The damage is okay, I'm getting the single target in, but once things get hectic, we really need the GMP to be able to clear the phoenixes and also clear Phoenix himself from a bit more off-screen action. The damage then in the end wasn't too bad, and the lightning warp playstyle does get you in trouble if you don't click the arena just right sometimes, so that's also kind of a nuisance. Overall, doable, but with any sort of hard mods it would be really insane to do, and the damage just would not hold up either. And then we have Minotaur, who constantly tries to close the gap, and the only reason it's not too bad is because the mods on the map aren't that hard. I think it's just got some monster life, some minus max, which isn't very you know, threatening from Minotaur. And then the decoy totem we have, he seems to be able to attack for a good little while, giving us the opportunity to get some damage in. If you have something like some, you know, movement speed on Minotaur, some faster attacks, some damage, some area, basically fucking anything on Minotaur, and that fight would be a nightmare. So while all doable, the Guardians were basically a nightmare for this character, and it wasn't very much fun having to play around them, even though my character is basically perfectly geared and set up for this Ice Spear shenanigans. It is a berserker, it's got about as much damage as you can possibly get, it's fairly defensive as well, and it was a somewhat lackluster result, I'd say. So Shaper himself is what we're up to here, and it is the 3rd phase I'm showing you, which isn't too bad as far as our mechanics and Shaper goes, because he, for the most part, will sit at range against you, and you can get some good damage in, but it is a bit clunky overall. But Shaper is probably the easiest of the examples for Endgame for Ice Spear to be able to take down in this sort of context. Once again, a threshold jewel with some additional proj would go a very long way to making targeting and killing ads and all that sort of stuff a lot easier, but not entirely necessary over here. The arena is fairly small, and he's not too threatening if you keep playing around his sort of attacks. Damage isn't super impressive, but it is doable, and it is a okay fight for us, but I did mess up a few times and end up dying. So you will get to see those. I'm not going to edit any of those out. This is the 3rd phase. The first 2 phases went by pretty cleanly, not super fast, and were a bit of a mess. But the 3rd phase, stuff does start to get a bit hectic with the ad and the way you have to dodge all the things, and ultimately I do mess up a bit, as you can see right here. So the balls are coming for me. I expect the balls to come again in that direction where I just was, so I sidestepped into more balls where I did not expect them. And then I die over here by messing up because the zone-in timer is apparently like 3 or 4 seconds, and that's something I've completely forgotten they've put into the Shaper fight, thanks to people cheesing the balls and all that for mechanic stuff. It's not something I was too aware of things, since I don't really do zoning in and out that often, and it got me killed as well. So a couple of shitty deaths there that were avoidable, but overall, you know, the more you mess up, the more hectic it gets, especially in Phase 3, so it did end up being a fairly challenging kill in the end, but something that is doable, just not something I'd really recommend. Once again, I was trying to place a ball over there and then got myself wrecked because I was not moving fast enough. In the end, Shaper died and we were happy with our progress. So that brings a draw to the character, comes to a close. I don't at all recommend playing Ice Spear Berserker. If you want to follow it though, for God knows what reason, I will show you the setup and talk about how I built this character. The overall build of Caster Berserker though, you can kind of follow and use this template, because you can pretty much use any other spell and build around it with some thresholds or whatever, and it will work out on the fire, lightning, chaos, and even ice side of things. This sort of Caster Berserker worked out pretty well. It's just Ice Spear itself that's kind of shit. So up to you guys. I will go over it right now though. So level 91 is what we were, a Berserker. Now the main point of that is to get the more damage, and then also the huge amounts of leech from life and mana, and then cloaked in savagery, huge amounts of leech as well. So that does of course mean you have to travel to Valpact. Starting here you do waste a few nodes, but overall it still ends up being pretty good with the amount of life you can grab, and then grabbing mind over matter and having this much unreserved mana made us a pretty tanky character. 5.7k life, 2k mana, and a whole bunch of mana and life leech, so we are fairly high on the sustain there as well. And I built this one around Pledge of Hands because level 30 Echo with the basically 7th link and the bunch of spell damage and the extra mana gave us a bunch of extra defense, and then damage seemed to be the best way to build the character. I think dual void batteries might have been a little better damage wise, but a bit tougher to build around because then you have to get the power charges and up there and there and there, and then the defense is a little bit worse because you don't get all that extra mana and all that. I did think that Pledge of Hands is probably the best way to build this character, so I did buy a 6-link pledge and build around that. That of course means you can't shield charge or whirling blades, but it does also give you these nifty little nodes over here for a bit more damage. So the reason you don't really want to go daggers, because you don't really need crit for this version. That's, you know, something that Ice Spear takes care of with the secondary phase, a bunch of extra crit and all that. Whereas if you're a different skill, like, you know, let's just say Freezing Pulse, maybe you want to spec into crit nodes like this, and then run a dagger and shield setup and still shield charge around and get some pretty nice clear speed going and playstyle compared to this one. So that's just a bit of a different passive tree, but the idea would still be the same, I think. Overall, the passive tree here is pretty routine, I'd say. Bunch of life, trying to get as much spell damage and crit multi and jewel sockets as possible. So my jewel sockets are all pretty good, and they're not very hard to get at the moment, since not too many people are going for these cold skill sort of jewels, especially with staff nodes if you can find them. So a lot of these are 4 props and they're pretty damn insane. I managed to buy most of them from anywhere from like 5C to 30C. Didn't pay any more than that just because they're not in high in demand. But yeah, you travel around, you get all these jewel sockets, and that's a pretty big chunk of your damage and where you get a lot of your crit multi from. And that does bring me to the DPS side of things. Our Ice Spear in the Path of Building, which I will give you the link to look around with, in pure single target mode with these gems over here, is 789,000 against Shaper in your second form. So that's when you have a lot of crit. 789k certainly isn't bad. It's just mechanically about up to you know, getting all those hits in consistently. So it's 789 at your ideal basically, which isn't always going to happen. And that is with the faster casting over here, whereas if you put in crit multi instead, that would be a higher chance of freezing things, and also in some situations a little bit more damage. But this would help you with some freezing action, whereas faster casting may still freeze, but get your freeze reapplied faster. So that's kind of something that you play around with there. And getting the 3 greens, 3 blues on my Pledge of Hands was pretty damn hard too. It took me something like 1,000 chromes. And then for our chest over here, didn't matter, didn't need a 6-link or anything like that, so I just grabbed a nice chest with effective health, so a bunch of health, mana, and some resists and all that. You can use pretty much anything in your chest. A combs is an option, but I could not afford to drop 6 sockets, so I just couldn't do that personally. If you can lose enough things in your build, or whatever caster build with Berserker you're doing, then by all means go for it, but I wanted my 6 sockets. And over here I put my Lightning Warp. So when you do use Lightning Warp as an actual teleporting skill or movement skill, to make it feel good you do need to have quality. It does need to be fairly high level. You then need less duration with quality. You need faster casting with quality, and also Swift Affliction as a 4th link. All of that together makes Lightning Warp feel, very acceptable. Not quite as good as Shield Charge, but acceptable. Without pretty much any one of these, you will feel just a little worse. Without all of these, it's going to feel terrible, so make sure you get a 4-link on your Lightning Warp. As far as our mana reservation, all really have is Clarity and Herald of Ice, and the rest unreserved. You could run a Blasphemy or some other stuff, but it doesn't really benefit me since I always want to be at a vast amount of range. So Blasphemy wasn't something I factored in, and just left a bunch of mana unreserved. Otherwise, we have Vile Haste attached to increased duration, and Frostbomb attached to increased duration with Arcane Surge. So I'm always keeping up Arcane Surge 100% of the time with my Frostbomb action. So that's a very nice setup there, and it also gives you the minus cold resist quite a lot of the time whenever you place it. Now, if you're a Berserker, you definitely want to cast when damage taken set up for your Leech. So for me, I have cast when damage taken, increased duration, Decoy Totem, which doesn't really matter for cast when damage taken, and then Firestorm. So whenever you get hit, to proc cast when damage taken, Firestorm will hit something and hit it multiple times, and hopefully you got Savage hit, and then you have 100% of damage leached as life, meaning most of those Firestorms will bounce you from 0 to 100% life, and that is pretty damn important for your survivability. You can also use something like Blade Vortex for your Berserker if you're into that sort of thing, but it is very handy to have a cast when damage taken on a Berserker if you have Vile Pact. Besides that, I do have Herald of Ice attached to Onslaught and Enlighten over here. Not very important, but if I've got it, why not use it? I've been self-casting Frostbite on any single target or bosses. It's not a huge drawback, but it is, worse than a Blasphemy, just comfort style. But it has been just fine for most bosses and all of that. And then Opal Rings, nothing too special. Try and roll them with Hatreds if you can. Get some life and resists. And the only other real fun item is Pandemonious. Now, this is the upgraded version of Halcyon from Tool Breach. It's pretty damn good. It's not much better than just a rare amulet with cast speed and crit multi and all of that, but it is a little better once you get to the end game for Shaper and Guardians. When they have a lot of resists, this ends up being just a bit better on damage. But you can't discount the defensiveness. Chill enemy for 1 second when hit, and blind chilled enemies on hit. The blind should come into play quite a lot for defense purposes, and actually be very useful indeed. So I thought it was worth playing with while they're not super expensive at the moment. The rest of the gear you can have a look at yourself, but other than that, the only thing to really mention, Wise Oak, try and overcap your resists so that cold is the biggest one. For me, it's cold and fire, and that means we penetrate cold. Dying Sun, basically huge quality of life to be able to get more projectiles, especially when you're in single target mode. You can then shoot 3 projectiles whenever it's up. Diamond Flask, not super important, but it does help when we're in our first phase, attacking close and don't really want to move from things, because then we fill out our crit a bit more there. And then lastly, when I just go into single target, I replace GMP with Hypothermia, and we shoot a single spear, and that's all there is to it. I did manage to Vile a level 21 Ice Spear because I was leveling 5 of them in my offhand, so I recommend to do that whenever you're leveling a skill of some sort. Level a bunch of your skills in the offhand, and chances are you get a level 21 when they hit level 20. That's about it for the character, guys. Just a nice template for a Berserker caster if you don't want to play Ice Spear. Otherwise, Ice Spear. I don't at all recommend it. It does take a fair amount of nice fine-tuning and gear to even feel remotely good. The clear is okay, the mapping is okay, nothing mind-blowing, and the bossing is pretty average. Overall, it was still pretty fun. I did enjoy playing the character and building it, but I can't at all recommend it to anyone out there if you're looking for something to do. It's entirely on you guys if you want to play it. I take no responsibility for the pain you will feel playing this character or Ice Spear in the future. Thank you very much for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video and the rundown, and I will see you next time.